There are moments in the life of a republic when the machinery of government shifts from political theater to constitutional crisis. This is one of those moments. The United States Senate has been called into emergency session, not for war, not for economic collapse, but for something far more foundational, the question of whether the Constitution can disqualify a president and whether the legislative branch will enforce that disqualification. Warren Buffett once said that someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago. The Constitution is that tree. The question before the Senate is whether they will let it stand or allow it to be uprooted because upholding it has become politically inconvenient. What you are about to witness is not a trial. It is not an impeachment. It is something the founders anticipated but hoped would never be necessary, the legislative branch being forced to decide whether constitutional disqualification will be enforced or ignored. The decision made in this emergency session will echo for generations. It will determine whether future presidents operate within constitutional boundaries or whether those boundaries become suggestions that powerful executives can simply bypass. Emergency sessions of the United States Senate are extraordinary events. Throughout American history, they have been reserved for existential threats, declarations of war, economic catastrophe, sudden succession crises, or constitutional emergencies that cannot wait for the regular legislative calendar. When Harry Truman called an emergency session in 1948, it was to address housing and inflation crises threatening economic stability. When special sessions were called during Reconstruction, it was to determine whether the Union would be restored under constitutional law or descend into permanent regional conflict. This emergency session is different in one critical respect. It concerns not an external threat, but an internal one. The threat is not to territory or economy, but to the constitutional order itself. Warren Buffett has often spoken about the importance of institutional trust. In his letters to shareholders, he emphasizes that systems work when participants believe the rules will be applied fairly and consistently. Markets function because investors trust that fraud will be prosecuted. Democracy functions because citizens trust that power will transfer peacefully and that constitutional limits will be enforced. When that trust erodes, institutions collapse not through dramatic revolution, but through gradual normalization of rule-breaking. What was once unthinkable becomes controversial. What was controversial becomes routine. What was routine becomes the new baseline from which further erosion begins. To understand why the Senate has been called into emergency session, we must understand the specific constitutional mechanism at issue. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868 during Reconstruction, it was designed to prevent individuals who had engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding federal office. The provision was created to address a specific problem: Confederate leaders who had taken up arms against the Union seeking to return to positions of power in the very government they had tried to destroy. The language is straightforward. No person shall hold any office under the United States who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. The provision is self-executing. It does not require new legislation. It does not require criminal conviction. It requires only that the factual predicate be established, that an individual having taken an oath to support the Constitution engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Federal courts have now made factual findings establishing that predicate with respect to Donald Trump and the events of January 6, 2021. Multiple judicial proceedings examining evidence presented under oath and subject to cross-examination have concluded that Trump engaged in conduct that meets the constitutional definition of insurrection. This is not a political opinion. This is a judicial finding of fact made by courts applying constitutional standards to specific evidence. The emergency session has been triggered because judicial findings alone cannot resolve the matter. The Constitution's separation of powers requires legislative involvement. When constitutional disqualification affects a major party nominee or sitting president, courts can determine facts. But enforcement of disqualification at the presidential level requires coordination among the branches of government. This is where constitutional theory meets political reality. The judiciary has made its determination. The executive branch is led by the individual subject to disqualification. The legislative branch must now decide whether it will enforce the Constitution's clear language or defer to political considerations. It is essential to understand what this emergency session is not. This is not an impeachment proceeding. Impeachment is a political process by which Congress removes an official for high crimes and misdemeanors. It requires a House majority to impeach and a two-thirds Senate supermajority to convict and remove. Constitutional disqualification under the 14th Amendment operates differently. It is not a punishment. It is not removal for misconduct. It is a constitutional eligibility requirement, similar to the requirement that presidents be natural-born citizens or at least 35 years old. The Senate's role in this emergency session is not to retry the facts. The courts have established the facts. The Senate's role is to determine how to implement constitutional disqualification in a manner consistent with separation of powers and due process. This procedural distinction matters enormously. The founders understood that democracy could be weaponized against itself. They understood that sufficiently. Popular figures could gain power and then use that power to dismantle the constitutional order. The 14th Amendment's disqualification provision is one of the mechanisms designed to prevent this. It says, in effect, certain actions place you outside the constitutional framework regardless of your popularity. No figure better embodies the Senate's current dilemma than Mitch McConnell. For decades, McConnell has positioned himself as the ultimate institutionalist. He understands Senate procedure better than perhaps anyone in modern American politics. He has consistently framed his political career around preserving Senate prerogatives and constitutional structure. Mitch McConnell has also been willing to make ruthless political calculations. He blocked Merrick Garland's Supreme Court nomination, arguing that election year appointments should be left to voters. He pushed through Amy Coney Barrett's nomination weeks before an election, reversing that principle when it served his interests. Now McConnell faces a choice that cannot be finessed through procedural maneuver. The judiciary has made factual findings of insurrection. The Constitution contains clear disqualification language. McConnell cannot block a vote indefinitely. He cannot punt to the next Congress. The emergency session forces a decision. McConnell's calculation is no longer about preserving options. It is about legacy. He is 82 years old. He will not run for leadership again. His career is in its final chapter. The question is how history will record his role in this constitutional crisis. Dr.
First, McConnell leads the Senate to enforce constitutional disqualification. He will face immediate backlash from Trump's supporters. He will be accused of betrayal. He will likely face censure from state Republican parties. But history will record that when the constitutional order was tested, he chose the Constitution over party loyalty. If McConnell refuses to act, or if he orchestrates a procedural outcome that allows disqualification to be ignored, he will maintain his standing within the current Republican coalition. But history will record that when American democracy needed institutional defenders, the self-proclaimed institutionalist chose political survival over constitutional duty, war. And Buffett has often noted that reputation is built slowly and destroyed quickly. Institutional reputation operates the same way. The Senate has spent 235 years building its reputation as a deliberative body that places national interest above immediate political gain. That reputation can be destroyed in a single session if senators choose to ignore constitutional obligations because enforcing them has become politically difficult. To understand the pressure senators face, we must understand the loyalty system that Donald Trump has built and weaponized throughout his political career. Trump's approach to political relationships is transactional and hierarchical. He demands absolute loyalty but offers none in return. He expects subordinates and allies to sacrifice their careers, their reputations, and if necessary, their freedom to protect him. When they do so, he expresses appreciation. When they decline or when they assert constitutional or legal obligations that conflict with his interests, he turns on them with remarkable speed and ferocity. Jeff Sessions served as one of Trump's earliest and most loyal Senate supporters. He was rewarded with the position of Attorney General. When he recused himself from the Russia investigation, following clear Justice Department ethics rules, Trump turned on him. He publicly humiliated Sessions for months, eventually forcing his resignation, and then supported his opponent in a subsequent Senate primary.
William Barr served as Attorney General and consistently protected Trump's interests, even releasing a misleading summary of the Mueller report that framed its findings in the most favorable possible light. But when Barr acknowledged that the 2020 election was not stolen and refused to use the Justice Department to overturn the results, Trump turned on him. Mike Pence served as vice president for 4 years. He defended Trump through every controversy. He never publicly contradicted him. But when Pence concluded that he lacked constitutional authority to unilaterally reject electoral votes on January 6, Trump encouraged a crowd that subsequently chanted for Pence to be hanged. Trump has since said that Pence deserved the threats against him. This pattern is not accidental. It is not personality. It is strategy. Trump creates a system in which loyalty flows only one direction, on. He demands that others sacrifice their institutional positions, their constitutional obligations, and their long-term reputations to serve his immediate interests. This creates a powerful incentive structure for Republican senators. They know that if they enforce constitutional disqualification, they will face Trump's wrath. They also know, based on observed pattern, that even if they protect Trump now, he will not protect them later if doing so conflicts with his interests. The rational calculation, therefore, is not about maintaining Trump's favor. That favor is conditional and temporary. The rational calculation is about whether the Constitution will be enforced. A common question is, if courts have made factual findings supporting disqualification, why does the Senate need to be involved? The answer lies in the structure of American government and the limits of judicial power. Courts can interpret law. They can make factual findings. They can issue rulings, but they cannot independently enforce those rulings in cases involving the presidency without legislative cooperation. This is not a flaw in the system. It is a feature. The founders designed a system of separated powers precisely to prevent any single branch from exercising unchecked authority. The judiciary's power depends on the executive branch to enforce its orders and on the legislative branch to provide the institutional framework for implementation. When judicial rulings involve the executive branch itself, this creates a structural tension. A president cannot be expected to enforce judicial rulings that disqualify him from office. That would require the executive to act against its own interests, something no institutional structure can reliably expect. This is why the legislative branch must be involved. If the Senate enforces constitutional disqualification, the immediate political consequences will be heavier. Trump supporters will be outraged. Republican senators who vote to uphold disqualification will face primary challenges. There will be protests and accusations of coup and claims that democracy has been stolen. But step back from the immediate reaction and consider the long-term institutional consequences. First, the Senate will have established that constitutional provisions are enforceable even against popular political figures. This precedent will constrain future presidents from both parties. Second, the Senate will have demonstrated that the rule of law applies to the powerful. When citizens observe that laws constrain ordinary people but not presidents, they lose faith in the system itself. Third, the Senate will have preserved its own institutional legitimacy. The Senate's power derives not from force but from the perception that it acts as a legitimate constitutional actor. If the Senate declines to enforce clear constitutional provisions, because doing so is politically difficult, it signals that the Senate is purely a political body, not a constitutional one. Fourth, enforcement creates a clear line for future conduct. Presidents will know that certain actions place them outside constitutional protection. This clarity, while harsh, is stabilizing. Warren Buffett frequently emphasizes that institutions create value through predictability and consistent rule following. Markets reward companies that have clear governance structures and that enforce their own rules. The same principle applies to political institutions. A Senate that enforces the Constitution, even when politically costly, creates long-term institutional value, even if it incurs short-term political costs. Now consider the alternative. If the Senate declines to enforce constitutional disqualification, what are the long-term consequences? First, the Senate establishes that constitutional provisions be ignored when enforcing them as politically inconvenient. This precedent applies not just to the 14th Amendment, but to all constitutional provisions. If disqualification can be bypassed through political pressure, what about emoluments? What about age requirements? What about term limits? The answer will be any constitutional provision can be bypassed if the political cost of enforcement is high enough. Second, the Senate signals that presidents operate outside constitutional constraint. If a president can engage in insurrection and remain eligible for office, what else can he do? The precedent is not limited to Trump. Every future president will understand that constitutional limits are unenforceable if you command sufficient political loyalty. This is how democracies erode, not through sudden military coups, but through gradual expansion of executive power and gradual failure of other branches to check that expansion. Third, the Senate's institutional authority collapses. If senators will not enforce the Constitution when the stakes are highest, why should anyone respect their authority when the stakes are lower? Fourth, the political system destabilizes because there are no longer agreed-upon rules. If constitutional provisions are negotiable based on political power, then politics becomes purely about accumulating enough power to ignore rules. Warren Buffett has observed that it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If the Senate declines to enforce constitutional disqualification in this moment, that reputation will be destroyed. It will not recover in the lifetimes of current senators. Future generations will look back on this session as the moment when the Senate chose political survival over constitutional duty. Every senator facing this vote understands the stakes. They understand that voting to enforce constitutional disqualification will likely end some of their political careers. They also understand that constitutional duty is not contingent on convenience. The oath they took was to support and defend the Constitution, not to support and defend it only when doing so aligns with political interest. This is the nature of constitutional governance. In ordinary times, political interest and constitutional duty align. But constitutional systems are not designed for ordinary times. They are designed for moments when political incentives and constitutional obligations diverge. The Senate can enforce constitutional disqualification and face immediate political backlash, or it can decline to enforce disqualification and establish that constitutional provisions are unenforceable against sufficiently powerful presidents. There is no middle ground. Delay is a decision. Procedural maneuvering is a decision. Silence is a decision. Each senator will be recorded as having made a choice, even if that choice is to avoid making an explicit choice. History does not judge legislators by whether they won their next election. History judges legislators by whether they preserved or undermined the constitutional order during moments of crisis. The founders created a system in which difficult decisions would sometimes be necessary. They expected that some of those decisions would require political courage. They expected that legislators would sometimes need to choose between political survival and constitutional duty. This emergency session will answer a single question. Does the United States still have a constitutional system in which presidential power is limited by law, or has it transitioned to a system in which sufficiently popular presidents operate outside constitutional constraint? The answer to that question will shape American governance for decades. Warren Buffett once observed that the most important NT quality for an investor is temperament, not intellect. The same is true for legislators. What matters in this moment is not cleverness or political skill. What matters is the temperament to do what is constitutionally required, even when it is politically costly. The senators voting in this emergency session did not choose to face this decision. They did not campaign on constitutional crisis. Many would prefer to avoid the choice entirely. But the crisis exists whether they acknowledge it or not. The constitutional question is before them, whether they wish it to be or not. They can choose to enforce the Constitution and face the political consequences, or they can choose to ignore the Constitution and face the historical consequences. But they cannot avoid choosing. Power without accountability always expands. When presidents learn that constitutional limits will not be enforced, they will push those limits further. When legislatures demonstrate that they will not check executive overreach, executives will overreach more. When institutions decline to defend themselves, they invite their own irrelevance. This is where institutions either hold or fail. The emergency session now underway will determine which path the United States takes. It will determine whether the Constitution remains the supreme law of the land or becomes a historical document that once constrained power, but no longer does. The decision belongs to the Senate. History will record how they chose.